There are some stories that change your life forever. The story I am about to tell you began as an innocent mistake but quickly turned into a nightmare. I, Diana, believed I had the perfect marriage at the age of 25, a marriage I had always dreamed of. My husband, Paul, was loving, hard-working, and always supportive. However, one night, an innocent encounter set off a chain of events that turned my life upside down. That night, I did something I shouldn't have. I kept a secret, made a mistake, and had to face the consequences. In this story, you'll see how innocence turned into a grave error, how a marriage fell apart piece by piece, and how my life ultimately became a nightmare. But the real question is, how does this nightmare end? It was about a year ago when I made what was perhaps the biggest mistake of my life. Everything in my marriage with Paul was going smoothly. We were in our 3rd year together and our 1st year of marriage. Paul had to leave town for 3 weeks due to a construction project. During that time, we stayed in touch daily via FaceTime because we missed each other so much. On the first weekend, 2 of my single friends invited me to join them at a club. Initially, I declined, unsure of how I would explain this to Paul and my family. But they persisted, and I eventually gave in. That night, I had no idea everything was about to change. When we arrived at the club, my friends immediately hit the dance floor. I, however, chose to sit at our table, trying to suppress the unease growing inside me. While everyone danced and had fun, my mind was solely on Paul. In those moments of solitude, I reflected on our marriage, the memories we shared. A feeling of guilt began to rise within me. I knew I shouldn't be there. After a while, my friends returned to the table with their dance partners. At that moment, a man named Joe joined us. Joe was a friend of one of my friend's dance partners. When the others went back to the dance floor, Joe stayed with me at the table. Initially, I tried to maintain a cold distance. But as our conversation progressed, Joe's warm demeanor and words began to ease my tension. The discomfort I had felt earlier slowly faded away. During our chat, I noticed Joe's interest in me, but I chose to ignore it. In that moment, perhaps for a brief second, I felt valued. And that was the biggest illusion that led me to make a mistake. As the night wore on, I realized that my friends were becoming increasingly intoxicated. Joe offered to help me get them into the car. At that moment, I knew I shouldn't spend any more time with him, but a voice inside me insisted that it was harmless. Maybe deep down, I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't admit it to myself. After dropping off my friends at their homes, I began driving Joe back to his place. Throughout the drive, Joe's calmness had an even greater impact on me. When we arrived at his place, he invited me to stay a little longer. Just 15 more minutes, just a friendly chat, he insisted. Despite the growing guilt within me, I tried to convince myself that accepting this invitation was innocent. However, as I stepped through the door, I knew I was making a huge mistake. Once inside Joe's apartment, we continued talking for a while longer, but there was an undeniable attraction simmering beneath our words. Joe's eyes were locked onto mine while I tried to avoid his gaze. Then Joe leaned in and softly kissed my lips. I hesitated for a moment, but I couldn't stop myself. That kiss quickly turned more passionate, and things spiraled out of control. Within minutes, I found myself in his arms, all rational thoughts slipping away. Immediately afterward, I was overwhelmed with guilt. I knew what I had done was wrong and told Joe that this could never happen again, and that I never wanted to see him again. Joe, too, seemed to share my regret. "This was a mistake," he said. "I won't bother you again." We didn't exchange any contact information and I left his apartment, but the guilt inside me was growing. This was a mistake that would never happen again, but one that would haunt me. A week later, when my period was late, I realized that this mistake wasn't going to leave me alone. I suspected that I was pregnant and rushed to the pharmacy in a panic to buy a pregnancy test. When the test confirmed my pregnancy, my world came crashing down. When Paul returned home, I tried to act as if nothing had happened, but the secret I carried was eating me alive. If I was pregnant, I was certain the baby was Joe's because Paul and I had always used protection. I knew I couldn't keep this heavy secret any longer, so I decided to tell my mother and sister about the situation. Their reaction was far more intense than I had expected. My mother, with tears in her eyes, looked at me and said, "Diana, how could you do this? Paul loves you so much. Why would you make such a mistake?" My sister sat silently, her head in her hands, listening to me. Both of them loved Paul dearly and couldn't understand how I could have made such a mistake. My mother reminded me of our strict Catholic beliefs, saying, "You cannot end this pregnancy. It goes against our faith." In my fear of losing Paul, I begged my mother and sister, "I can't tell him. Paul will leave me." But my mother and sister were resolute. "If you don't tell him, we will," they said. I knew they were right, so I asked them to be there for support. When Paul came home, I asked him to sit down, and I told him my terrible secret. He didn't react as I had expected. He quietly stood up, went to the kitchen, and thought things over. As I cried with my mother and sister, Paul just watched us, tears welling up in his eyes, but he said nothing. At that moment, his silence terrified me even more. Finally, he told me that he needed a few days to think and left the house. Over the next week, I bombarded Paul's phone with messages and voicemails, telling him how much I loved him and that we needed to build a family together. But Paul's response was silence. A week later, I was devastated when his attorney called to inform me that Paul had filed for divorce and that there was no longer any place for me in his life. 2 months later, we met in court. The moment I saw Paul, I couldn't hold back my tears, and I wanted to run to him. But my mother and sister held me back. "This is your mistake. You have to accept it," they said. Paul gave me one last look and said, "I'm moving on with my life, Diana, and you should do the same." That was the last time I saw him. I informed Joe about the pregnancy, and a DNA test confirmed that he was the father. Joe agreed to pay child support, but I have no romantic feelings for him. In fact, I harbored deep resentment toward him for the destruction he caused in my life. Joe's entrance into my life didn't just ruin my own life. It destroyed Paul's and my daughter's lives as well. This is a burden I have to carry. Today, 2 years later, I'm still living with my mother, raising a baby girl. My mother, father, and sister have always supported me. But the pain of losing Paul is still fresh in my heart. I carry a relentless guilt and remorse for the mistake that turned my life upside down. Sometimes I find myself wishing I could go back in time to change that moment. If I hadn't gone to the club that night, if I hadn't met that man, maybe I'd still have my happy marriage today. Last week, while shopping, I ran into Paul again. In that moment, it felt like my heart stopped. When my daughter smiled and waved at him, I felt that familiar pain once more. Paul smiled back at her and wished us well before quietly walking away. As I watched him leave for the last time, I felt an unhealed wound deep within me. In that moment, I thought about how, even though Paul wasn't my daughter's biological father, there could have been a bond between them. Paul knew she needed a father, and that's why he treated her kindly. But in that moment, I realized that Paul would never come back to me, that he had moved on with his life. Now I know it's time to turn a new page in my life.